There are over 500 of us, woohoo, 500 of us registered for this summit. And we are from 40 states and over 32 different countries. Just a few of the names of the countries: Australia, Belgium, Brazil, Canada, Rwanda, Japan, Trinidad, Philippines, Lebanon, Ireland. We're holding hands around the world. Hopefully we'll get a chance to list all of the countries on our website. I am reminded of a famous quote from the movie, The Field of Dreams, thinking of all of you gathering and registering for this. If you build it, they will come. So thanks so much for coming. My name is Cindy Fisher, and I'm at regroundinglove.com, and I'm a core member of the organization Rethinking Psychiatry, and also a member of Mind Freedom International. I have an adult child who has been in psychiatric hospitals way too many times, and broken communities way too many times. And I have been heartbroken, outraged, and shocked at their experiences in both settings way too many times. And so I've become not only a passionate, but fierce advocate for change, for creating spaces and places and communities where all hearts can heal and grow strong and belong. I am celebrating that the locked doors that currently confine my child will open on October 13th, right in the middle of this historic summit. I'm believing that that is a good sign for him and all like him to come. And with that thought, I want to acknowledge the individual who first envisioned the summit, a dear friend, an amazing ally for my child, myself, and for our community. This International Peer Respite Soteria Summit was the vision of Grace Sylvia. And the original organizations that supported and encouraged her were Rethinking Psychiatry and Mind Freedom International. Rethinking's mission is about rethinking psychiatry, creating community, educating, and advocating for choices. Mind Freedom's mission is to lead a nonviolent revolution of freedom, equality, truth, and human rights that unites people affected by the mental health system with movements for justice everywhere. In a short amount of time, Grace had reached out around the world to other individuals and organizations that had a shared passion for choice and alternatives. And the International Peer Respite Soteria Summit volunteer planning team was born. A big warm thank you to all of you on the team who contributed time, resources, ideas to make this summit a reality. And also, it is important to add that many of you have donated small and large donations. And we are so grateful for all of your donations to help carry this vision forward. And now you'll see on the screen the names of our sponsors. They are the National Empowerment Center, NIASPRS, the New York Association of Psychiatric Rehabilitation Services Incorporated, Montana's Peer Network, Intentional Peer Support. This Intentional Peer Support is in honor of Sherry Mead, who was the founder of the first peer-run respite in the world. ISEP, International Society for Ethical Psychology and Psychiatry. Emotional CPR, an anonymous sponsor in honor of emotional CPR, ECPR. People USA, and Al Gaze. Now, just a quick reminder now, Ty one of our key and amazingly multi-talented organizers, will introduce himself and has some important information and Zoom housekeeping tips to share. Enjoy the day. Ty?
Greetings, everyone. My name is Ty, and I'm so glad there's so many people here today. I'm personally excited to be a part of this summit. I joined because I wanted to bring Peer Run Respite and Soteria to my home state of Colorado. Forward to having a discussion and interacting with everyone who wants to participate. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Robert Whitaker, a person that has been a champion for many of our movements and writing books such as Anatomy of an Epidemic and Mad in America. Thank you so much for all being here. Robert, I leave it to you.
Well, Ty, thanks very much for that nice introduction. I just want to say it's a real honor and a pleasure to be here. And I want to thank Rethinking Psychiatry for this invitation. I also think what is going on in these next 5 weeks is extremely important for helping people think in a new direction. So what I'm going to do here is I was asked to speak about 10-15 minutes for historical context for thinking about peer respite houses and Soteria projects. And then we'll have 45 minutes of discussion with three people who have been running and helping create peer respite houses. We'll have a break, and then we'll have 45 minutes with 3 panelists related to the Soteria project. So the big picture to think about, I think there is a big picture to understand conceptually here. And if you go back all the way back to colonial days, basically, or the early days of the United States, we really see in this history of psychiatry 2 sort of broad themes. One is where you conceive of psychiatric problems as a medical disorder, as a mental, as a physical illness, and you do try to do something to knock down the symptoms of, quote, that illness. And then the other alternative conception, an alternative way of thinking about things and what we need to do as a society is thinking of really around environmental responses, where we see that human beings respond to their environments. Sometimes they have environments that lead to great difficulties, but that being in a supportive environment can in fact be a path back to wellness or back to having a robust life in society, et cetera. So those are the 2 big themes. Now, sometimes we think of the disease model as so related to the arrival of antipsychotics, and in particular DSM-3 in 1980, when the American Psychiatric Association did in fact adopt a disease model for diagnosing and treating psychiatric disorders. But if you really go way back to the late 1700s and the early 1800s, the father of American psychiatry is often said to be Benjamin Rush, and he saw it as a illness. And so, for example, one of the first things he invented was something called the Tranquilizer Chair, where someone who was, quote, psychotic or agitated would be strapped down to a chair for a long period of time and bled. And the idea was somewhat similar to chemical imbalances. The idea was, psychosis is due, or madness as they called it at the time, is due to too much blood rushing to the head. And so if we bleed these people, that's an antidote to that physical problem. Okay, so there was still that antidote. You're treating the symptom, you're treating some pathology. Now, I just want to say one thing real quickly before we move into the alternative. I'm pretty sure if you did a randomized clinical trial where you put someone in a chair and bled them, their symptoms, in fact, bled them profusely, their symptoms on rating scales would in fact diminish because they become quieter, they become lacking of energy, that sort of thing. So we tend to make fun of these, old forms of, quote, care or treatments, but they really were similar in conception, that this is an illness, that the treatment was supposed to be an antidote to that illness. And if you had a treatment that quieted someone, made them less able to interact with the world, it was often seen as effective. Now, the other line actually has a long history as well, and it really goes back to Quakers in York, England in the late 1790s, who rebelled against this form of harsh treatments that you found in, quote, medical textbooks at the time and asylums like Bedlam, etc. And here's the key, I think. So the Quakers in York, England in the late 1700s said, first of all, was humble. We don't know what is wrong, but we know these people are brethren. In other words, rather than the other, because in the illness model, people were seen as, because they had lost, they were no longer reasonable. They had moved down a level in sort of the level of being, almost to an animal-like level. But here with the Quakers, it was, they are brethren. We are all like each other. And so they said, what do we all want? And they said, well, we need shelter, we need good food, we need companionship, we need meaning, that sort of thing. And so the idea was that a retreat out in nature, because nature was seen as also part of an environment that could be healing, that time and a supportive environment, one that did provide these basics of shelter, meaning, good food, respect towards the person, a sense of agency for the other person, could in fact lead people back to recovery. Now, the York retreat opened in 1796. It was a small house out in the nature in York, England. It still exists today, by the way. And this was the idea. You should be kind, you should treat people as brethren. And the thought was this too. People who came here had a God-given capacity to recover, so it wasn't a sort of pessimistic thing. And even if people couldn't recover, the Quakers had an obligation to provide an environment that was as supportive and as kind as possible. And their results were this, because they did do outcome results. They found that 70% of those who had been ill less than 12 months before coming to the retreat recovered and did not relapse into illness. And even of those who had been chronically ill, treated in asylums like Bedlam, 25% recovered and then were able to go back into the community. Now, I'm going to go real quickly through some other outcomes of this type of care. And remember this figure of 65 to 70%. And by the way, when historians have gone back and looked at patient records of people treated, say, at the York Retreat or the early moral treatment asylums in the United States, these people were, quote, disturbed. It wasn't that there was a milder form of people coming to these places. These people would have otherwise been in, the psychiatric hospitals of the day, asylums of the day. In Worcester, Mass, there was a big study of all patients admitted from 1833 to 1846. And of 984 patients admitted during those 13 years, 58% recovered and remained well throughout their lives. And this was like a 35-year follow-up. 7% relapsed, but subsequently recovered and returned to the community. 35% become chronically ill. So what do you see again? About a recovery rate of about 2/3. Pennsylvania Hospital was another place that really had a moral therapy approach for a number of years during the 1800s. And they had a big study that looked at 8,546 patients treated from 1841 to 1882. And here were their outcomes, their collective outcomes during that 40-year period. 45% were discharged as cured, 25% were discharged as improved. Now, of course, they were being discharged into societies. There was no social safety net. So people had to go back to work. They obviously had to be in families, that sort of thing. So there's obviously a level of functionality happening when we're talking about people returning to the community. Now, we need to fast forward because for various reasons, moral therapy came to be seen as a discredited type of care. And the reason was it became so popular that asylums were built in many states. They grew in size, and counties began putting into these retreats, these centers, people with end-stage dementia, syphilis, other neurological disorders, and they became a dumping ground for elderly people, people with neurological diseases, and the discharge rates declined. And then we came under the spell of eugenics, and that was a horrible 50 years. But the next time I want to look at, and we're sort of looking at here is also, what is the natural recovery rate from what we call psychosis or serious mental illness? Because when we think about that, if it's in fact quite high, then if you have supportive environments, you can even expand on that sort of natural capacity to recover. Anyway, from 1945 to 1955, was a time when old ways were seen as discredited, lobotomy, electroshock, briefly. And we did get a sense of social psychiatry for a brief time, and also a sense of maybe supportive environments could be helpful. Anyway, from 1945 to 55, 1955 is when the first antipsychotics come in. And the memory is, the sort of conventional narrative is that until the time of antipsychotics, no one got released from the asylums. They just stayed there forever. Well, if you look at discharge and stay well rates from first episode psychotic patients from 1945 to 1955, you'll find studies such as this. At Warren State Hospital from 1946 to 1950, at the end of 3 years, 73% of those patients were living, of those first episode patients were living in the community. And again, this is before we had, disability insurance, that sort of thing, social services out in the community. At Delaware State Hospital, 70% of 216 schizophrenia patients were living in the community 6 years or more after initial hospitalization. You see the same in other countries, in Norway and all. So what we saw in this brief period before the arrival of antipsychotics, many people were going into the hospital, and frankly, those hospitals weren't great, that's for sure. And in fact, could be, I think, quite abusive, dismal environments, and still people were getting better and going back out. That speaks to this sort of natural capacity to recover. Now, going forward into that, we get the antipsychotics in 1955, they start to become the centerpiece of care. But in the 1970s, there were 3 studies to look at, are we really improving longer term outcomes with the use of these antipsychotics? One was a study, a 3-year study at University in San Francisco under Maurice Rappaport, randomized study. They found that those treated in the hospital without drugs compared to those treated in the hospital with drugs, and then the people are discharged, those treated without drugs had better 3-year outcomes. There was a 1-year study that also looked at the long-term effects of antipsychotics. And again, it was the people off medication that had the better outcomes. And then the big study was the Soteria project. It was imagined or created and designed by Lauren Mosher, who was head of schizophrenia studies at the NIMH at the time. And it really was meant to be the dividing line moment. We've been doing things where drugs are the first order of care, but how about environmental care? When you can be with people, you don't see people as ill, you see that supportive environments can help, being with others can help, and maybe some selective use of antipsychotics. People were randomized either to treatment or quasi-randomized, treatment as usual in the hospital, or to the Soteria project, which Voice Rendricks ran for 10 years. And there they didn't immediately put people on antipsychotics. They would if they weren't getting better after a period of time. And what were the results? The results were that at 6 weeks, the psychopathology in both groups had improved significantly and overall change was the same. In other words, this environmental care was just as good as drugs in decreasing the acute symptoms of psychosis. And at the end of 2 years, the Soteria patients had lower psychopathology scores, fewer hospital readmissions, and better global adjustments. So what we saw at this time, 50 years ago, was a different way of treating people, a different way of conceiving things. And it really was with the idea that environments, if you had supportive environments, in essence, that would allow for these sort of this natural capacity to recover, to flourish best. And if you think of this conception of us, we all know that's true. I mean, I think we all know that if we're in difficult environments, we start to feel very stressed and anxious, and other sort of discomforting things can happen to us. Whereas if we're in environments that we find supportive, friendly, we have food, we have shelter, well, we're going to feel better. So I don't think this idea of supportive environment should be seen as radical in any way. Anyway, unfortunately, and in terms of antipsychotic use in the Soteria projects, 42% had never been exposed to the drugs in the 2 years, 39% had used them temporarily, and 19% had used them regularly during the 2-year follow-up. So we had 2 visions of the future here. This was coming from the head of the NIMH, and what happened was the biological guys triumphed. They pushed Lauren Mosher out. They eventually shut down the Soteria project, and we got the disease model that has been with us since. as the sort of primary form of care. And what sort of outcomes are we seeing? The recovery rate for people diagnosed with schizophrenia is now down to 6%. That's the worst recovery rate in the history of outcome studies over the past century. You see there's a surge of bipolar diagnosis. Bipolar runs a much more chronic course than it used to. Disability numbers have soared. So now here it is, 2021, and what I'm saying to everyone is here is we're into, I think, another sort of, you're coming to the dividing place in the road again. Are we going to keep on going down this biological road, which hasn't done well? Or what respite houses, I think, and Soteria projects are offering all of us, and by that I mean societies, it's a different way of thinking about things, a different way of helping people. And I'm almost sure, let's go back to that 65, 70% recovery rates, would produce much, much, much better outcomes for those who come into such homes and really for society as a whole. So that's the conception of where we're at. I hope it shows why this summit is so important, because over the next 5 weeks, what we're really going to see is, or discuss and talk about, what are some of the environments that can be tried and are being created, and how are they being done, and what sort of challenges, and also what sort of successes are they seeing, what sort of joys, etc. So that's the introduction. And so if we can convene the panel on peer respite houses, we'll get started on that. So I should see Roslyn, Cindy, and Victoria come up. I don't know if I should introduce everybody now, but if they can come up on the screen. I'm gonna, and here's what we're gonna do. We have 45 minutes. I'm gonna ask Roslyn, Cindy, and Victoria to introduce themselves. Each one can spend about 5 minutes. Roslyn Hayes is the statewide director of peer services and training for the Georgia Mental Health Consumer Network, and she oversees 5 peer support, wellness, and respite centers in Georgia. Cindy Hodge has been a long-time leading figure with, when it was the Western Mass Recovery Learning Center, now it's Wildflower Alliance. They have a respite center called the Soteria House, and so Cindy will tell us about that. And Victoria Well co-founded the Monarch House Peer Run Respite in Wisconsin, and can talk about that. So first, and just to Roslyn, Cindy, and Victoria, I'm going to ask each of you, I'll call on each of you once to speak for about 5 minutes about yourself, introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your program, try to keep it to 5 minutes, and then I'll start asking questions for all of you, and you can take turns answering those questions. So Roslyn, why don't you take it away?
All right, thank you. Thank you so much. My name is Roslyn Hayes, and I'm really happy to be here with you all. I am with the Georgia Mental Health Consumer Network and have been with them for close to 11 years now. And I came to work initially, I became a certified peer specialist. I had, been, going through that up and down kind of roller coaster ride with trying to find lasting recovery. And it wasn't really until I came in contact with other peers, with other folks who were experiencing things similar to, what I was experiencing, that I was able to find that lasting recovery. And it was just so exciting for me to find that there was a place for folks like me, all of the things that I have experienced in my life that, that I wanted to hide from people, those things that I carried a lot of shame and guilt about. Someone came along and said, that's valuable. And there are others who need to know that, we go through things, but we get to the other side, and it doesn't mean that we need to go hide, but we can, be proud, productive members of society and support others in what it is that they hope for and dream for in their lives. And that's what I found, when I found the peer movement. And I was just so excited. I'm like, you mean you're gonna pay me for all of this stuff that, I never wanted to tell anybody? What? So I was very excited, and I just grabbed hold. Like I said, I went to work at the Georgia Mental Health Consumer Network in their first peer recovery and respite center, or peer wellness Peer Support and Wellness Center. We have three different names of our centers, and so they all kind of run together in my head. 5 centers, 3 different designations, but with our Peer Support and Wellness Center in Decatur that opened 10 years ago now. In 2008, I came to work there as a part-time staff person, and then eventually got to be full-time, and then got to be an assistant director, and then got to be the statewide coordinator as we've been able to expand. And it's been a really wonderful journey to see just the power of connection, the power of seeing people, not problems, and really just holding that space for folks to be who they are, and really having a place where it says it's okay, who you are, exactly how you are is great, and whatever it is that you want or need, let's figure it out together and see what we can create. It really has been an amazing journey. Having met like Sherry Mead and Chris Hansen and doing the whole intentional peer support thing has been really exciting for me. I've got an opportunity to train around the country doing that work, and so it really, it's something that everybody needs to know about, and that it's such an international thing that we have so many countries represented here, really does say how we all are so much alike. So much of the time the focus is on the differences and those things that separate us. But when we can really, recognize the commonalities that we share, and the dreams and the hopes and the wants, because they're all really similar. That's what I found. People want to be happy. People want to be themselves, and they want to be happy. And just figuring that out, and how to make it happen. It just has been a really exciting thing. Bob Whitaker, just reading your material and just the education that's come along with it. I just have a lot of gratitude, and I'm excited to be included as a part of this conference. So thank you.
And that was great. That was really a nice introduction. It certainly speaks to the brethren question or the brethren conception of things. Cindy, you next. Tell us a little bit about your who you are and your work with both the Wildflower Alliance and Soteria House.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. This is kind of a thrilling. I can remember when I first saw you speak, Bob, and I was furious because I didn't like the information you were giving me. What do you mean? Those drugs marketed as antipsychotics were actually harming me. And so I forgive however I reacted to you in the moment. And anyways, I'm somebody who comes to this from a place of having been diagnosed with schizophrenia. But in reality, I was a person who had experienced a lot of trauma and had also experienced a lot of spiritual experiences that were really helpful. But, within the medical model, those were diagnosable as well. And I was fortunate to find a Hearing Voices group being offered, one of the only ones. If I had been in Pennsylvania, I might have been in luck, but otherwise, one of the only ones offered in the entire country was offered through the Western Mass Recovery Learning Community. We're a community, and I showed up, and when I was there, they started talking about, how do we create options? How do we create alternatives? So many of us have been hurt in the mental health system. It's one thing to say this isn't working, but do we have an idea of what might be helpful? And we came together and we talked about peer respites, what would be an alternative to being in the hospital. And at the time, I think I was slowly coming off of medication. I was not in a paid role, but I was a member of the community, and what I felt and thought and my vast experience of being hospitalized was welcomed and valued. And we talked about it, and we were blessed to have Chris Hansen and Sherry Mead come and train everybody. And I can remember asking Sarah Davidow, the director, I'm not in a paid role, but I really want to go to this training. And she said, I'm going to try to fit you in. And in that training were all the people that I had been part of the hiring process for, to staff. the Peer Respite. It was really neat. I also got to advocate with them. Intentional peer support, is awesome. And I want people to be able to deal with me if I'm hearing voices. So we got in a hearing voices training and alternatives to suicide training, and that was really helpful. And so it was amazing. Right after AFIA opened in 2012, I was facing forced hospitalization. I'd got off my meds and I was hitting a bump in the road, and people were tired of seeing me struggle. And I was blessed to be able to go to AFIA instead. There are times where I have filled a few shifts there, but my perspective is really of one who, a community member who said, we need this, and being able to access those services and to be in this supportive space where somebody asked me what I think would be helpful, or what can they do to support me, versus being in an environment where people are telling you what you need to do, when you need to do it, how you need to do it, and not really asking you at all what's going on. And it's really neat to be able to be in an environment. Wildflower Alliance realizes that we're not just one-dimensional people, that our experience, our distress happens in a context, that may include poverty, racism, and other forms of oppression. And so I can go into this environment and people can say, yeah, that was awful what happened. Or you're right, that's not fair. And how we got to band together to try to change the world and make it more welcoming for everybody. I don't know if that was my 5 minutes, but I'm going to stop there.
Cindy, that's great. I mean, I think it's important that people here, we're going to talk about peer respite houses, but it's always important to know people as well. Who are they? What are their experiences that they brought with them to this moment? So Vic, you're up next. Tell us a little bit about yourself and the work with the Monarch House.
Thank you. My name is Vic Welly, and I am joining this call today from stolen land currently known as the state of Wisconsin in the United States, the ancestral homes of people, including the Dakota, Ojibwe, and Ho-Chunk peoples. And I want to offer greetings to any tribal elders, Indigenous people here today. And I think that's an important piece to recognize, because I think that this work of creating alternatives and creating space for healing from trauma also means recognizing the role of generational trauma that plays a part that we are all complicit in or possibly survivors of, and how do we create alternatives that bring together all of these different realities that we come to, because as we all are coming here today with this acknowledgement that this thing that gets called mental illness, these things that get called psychosis, don't just spring up magically from some place in the brain. It's the result of the different experiences and harms and many different environmental and social factors that play a role. And so what are we doing to not just heal ourselves, but to heal in community? And that's kind of the perspective I take as somebody who found themselves in and out of the mental health system in various different forms for many, many years, and found that the psychiatric system was not where I found healing. And I found my way to Peer Run Respite in a roundabout way, thinking about it on my own, thinking if only there could be a place where I could just come and just take a break and not have to go through these assessments and not have to, be questioned and locked away in a psych ward. And then to find out that, oh, there are these things called peer respites. And so about 5 years ago, I got an opportunity to move here to Wisconsin to be part of the Peer Run Respite programs that were being funded by the state of Wisconsin. And it's been an incredible journey to kind of provide this sort of support that I wish I had had when I was going through those difficult times and getting that label of serious and persistent mental illness put on me. and to be able to just make it happen. And it hasn't always been easy. There's been some ups and downs. The first program I was part of didn't succeed. And so then in 2018, a group of us were approached to restart a program. And so we started again. And that's where Monarch House got started. And the other piece I wanna touch on too is another shout out to intentional peer support. I think all three of us are trainers for intentional peer support, and the work of Sherry Mead has been so crucial, not just for peer run respites, but for this training of how to do peer support in a way that really centers relationships. And I think that's the piece too that I really want to highlight as why peer run respites work. It's because it's about the relationship. It's not about fixing. It's not about helping people cope better. It's about relationships.
Thank you, Vic. That's all really a nice introduction, I think, to this. I'm going to ask really quickly a very sort of nuts and bolts question just for the audience. How, in each of your houses, and this can take about 30 seconds, how many people can you have in the house at any one time, and how long can people stay? Just so people can get a sense of what a peer respite house does in the house and for how long.
For us, we can generally we have 3 people at a time, and for up to 7 nights, and then people are eligible every 30 days.
Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah.
Pretty much the same as Rosalind. 3 people, everybody has their own room, which is really neat if you're in a lot of distress or you want some rest, to have your own room, and 7 days. And yeah, after a certain amount of time, they can come back. One of the neat things we have though too is a community bridger, somebody to assist somebody to connect to whatever they want to connect to when they leave.
And Vic?
Monarch House has 4 bedrooms, and folks are able to stay up to 7 days. Currently with COVID restrictions, however, it's limited to 1 guest at a time.
Okay. The reason I ask, and we'll get to these questions a little bit later on, is your thoughts of how this can fit into a larger form of help or support or environments that can be, I mean, obviously you have an acute time, a crisis time, but sometimes people need longer forms of support and peer involvement, et cetera. So I just wanted to set that. Here's a question for all of you. When I did the beginning talk about environmental care, most of these, if we go back to moral therapy, that was run, nevertheless, even though it had a nice conception of brethren, but it was organized and run by the people who were, quote, doing the treating, so to speak. And Soteria also has that sense that it was top down. In other words, it was conceived of by people, psychiatrists, Lauren Mosher, et cetera. But now we have things that are bottom up, so to speak, grassroots, peer run. And Vic, what you said about intentional peer support, I think is really key. This just didn't spring out of, all of a sudden. There was a long path to this moment, building on many people, and you have Judy Chamberlain's On Our Own, etc. But can you speak to this? Why is it so important, or do you that this be conceived of, organized, run, staffed by people with experience? Because that's something that's really different now from all this history. Is it's a grassroots, you guys are you guys, I don't want to say that, but it's peer thought, organized run. Why is that important and why is it different?
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Rosalind.
Yeah, no,
I'm
you go
just
ahead.
all
I
three
don't
of
have to
you.
be the first one to answer every question. Go ahead.
All right. I think for a long time, having things done to us, even with the best of intentions, has led to harm. And I think that, being able to name what healing looks like for each one of us, and being able to create that space for other people to explore and to name what healing looks like for them, that's so crucial. And to do it in a way that is not with the permission of powers that be with psychiatrists or people looking over our shoulder. It gets away from that kind of paternalism and creates a space for true autonomy. And I think that it's essential that the peer-run respites remain peer-run, that they not be connected to a clinical program or have that kind of medical oversight, because without that autonomy, there's always that risk, at least in the United States. If there are clinical providers who have the power to lock you up, if you don't do things the right way, or quote unquote, whatever they are prescribing, as long as there's that fear of forced and coerced treatment, I don't think that true lasting healing can take place in a relational kind of way. At least that's been my experience.
That's great. Cindy, Roslyn?
Sure. We're gonna rotate places, I think, here. So why it's really important is who knows best what my experience is? Me. Not somebody who meets with me 5 minutes walking down a hallway in a hospital doing a checklist. In fact, in the hospital, why would I tell the truth? I want to get out someday, right? And so that idea that Vic brought up about force and control, that's really going to impact a relationship. And that's a great thing about peer respites. People only go there if they want to go there. They're not being coerced. When you take power and control out, people are allowed to focus on self-determination. And they asked me this question when I went there. They said, what would be helpful? And at first I was upset because I thought, everybody's the expert on me but me. And they got me to actually consider what I could do to be part of my own rescue, which is a really important piece of healing from trauma. And I get to tell my story the way I understand it in my framework. Thank you, IPS. And instead of somebody else telling me what my experience is and what it means. And the Wildflower Alliance, the whole organization is an organization of people who've gone through life-interrupting challenges, and they get to define those challenges in any way. And I may change how I define them over time. I may get different perspectives, and that's okay too. And so, who really is the expert? And now there may be plenty of people in clinical roles that have expertise in certain areas that I can benefit from. Absolutely. Like I went to a somatic therapist about, getting the trauma out of my body, the things I couldn't even remember that my body was having a reaction to. Awesome. But, the other thing I like to think about is I was told I was hopeless. I was told I would never recover. I would be on medication my whole life, and that I should accept and adjust to that prognosis. And that was actually part of me getting well, was accepting I couldn't get well, right? That was part of the game they played. And if I defied those odds, and lots of people have, maybe it's time to look at, if we were really scientific, we would say, well, your theory is inaccurate because it doesn't play out. And that's why it's important. It's important to have firsthand lived experience, because if people have been able to navigate out, if they're having this ability to create lives that they want to live, good quality lives, then maybe they know something. Like if I'm going to buy a car, I'm not going to buy the car that I'm going to be told is a lemon, is always going to break down. I would rather go to somebody who says, this is something workable, and it's going to run and it's going to work. And I really like, Robert, your statement about people healing. This idea that as people, we're designed to heal. We're designed to reach a good state. People want to do well, right? And so what has been the barrier? Where have the interruptions been? And so much of my enjoyment in life now is getting distance from a psychiatric diagnosis to the best of my ability, and to reclaim what works for me. And it may be a lot of trial and error in there, but that's not failure. That's getting closer to what will work. So thank you, And I'm really appreciating my co-presenters. Sorry, I had to say that.
Most of the audience is appreciating your co-presenters. Cindy. Rosalind, how about you?
Thank you.
Why the importance of being peer run?
I think and you know, being in the third position, I get to just recap what the other presenters just shared because they shared it so eloquently. But I think it's important because it's opportunity to really recognize and see a person and to honor our experiences, you know, to recognize, like Vic said earlier, you know, we didn't just land here, just dropped out of the sky and dropped into the system, you know, and thinking about the impact and prevalence of trauma and thinking about changing that question from, you know, what's wrong with you to what has happened. When I think about peer support and I think about what happens in the peer run respites, we all have story. We recognize that things have happened. We have these experiences and we're interested in hearing them. You know, we have space to honor those things rather than just focusing on, you know, this list of symptoms, you know, and this diagnosis and removing or losing the person in all of this. You know, we really seek to connect and honor the person. And in that, people become empowered. People recognize that they have value because for, you know, so long the message is that, you know, you don't know anything and you really, you know, someone else knows best for you. And when people are told that you don't know, you can't know, or you're wrong, if you get that message over and over, then, you know, it's just kind of sitting back and allowing ourselves to be swept up into the system. And peer support says, no, you know, you have value. There's mutuality here, you know, and each of us has something to contribute, you know, no matter what. And if we can tap into that, just that, you know, recognizing a person as a valuable entity, you know, just inherently with value. That's what we get in peer support and with peer respites. And I think that would be lost and is lost, you know, when we add the clinical side in, when the focus then becomes about this illness, rather than, you know, the focus being about this person and about their experience and about what they want to do with their lives and how we can, you know, support each other with doing that. And so, and that's where people, you know, people find their voice again, you know, because it's like, you have a voice, tell me, you know. We ask people, you know, much like Cindy said, you know, we ask people when they come into respite, you know, what is it that you want from this experience? And so often that's a question people can't answer because they've never been asked what they want. They've never been asked, you know, well, what do you think? And so just even doing that, people are like, what? You want to know what I want? Really? You're, you know, I get to tell you what I want. I get to tell you what I think, and you really want to hear it. That's powerful. And that starts to, you know, support people in standing up a little straighter and holding their head up a little higher and looking you in the eye. And as this unfolds, then, you know, people do step into their power and do, you know, take ownership of their recovery and of their lives. And so I think that's, you know, part of the value of it and why it's so important.
So those were three very powerful conceptual arguments of change, presentations of different conceptions. And I almost feel we could stop the summit now and it would be a success. Just to have that message out, that this is a reconceptualization of relationships, and instead of seeing what's wrong with people, seeing what's right with people and all that, I really think we can now declare the day a success just from those three answers. Next question is, I have three sort of, they're related but specific to each of you. And this is just a little bit more concrete to communicate the experience of what it's like in a respite house. So Cindy, you mentioned that you were, you know, you went there. So tell us a little bit about the nuts and bolts of, like, you knock on the door and then what happens when you come there? I mean, food, we've talked about the conception, but just give us a sense of what it's like to be there and get there.
So there's an initial conversation. you're supposed to call up and somebody might ask you, what's going on, and they might share, what the house is like, what the values are. And there would be a conversation about, whether that made sense. And in that moment, I was not able to have a really big conversation. And so I called up and I said, "Hi, it's me. What do I have to say?" And Ephraim, he wasn't the director at the time, but he was working there at the time. He said, "You said it. And yes, we do have a spot for you." Sometimes there is a wait list. We keep up to 3 names on the wait list. And recently we have this community bridger, so we have somebody can reach out to the people while they're on the wait list. And so I might have to call, a number of times before I can actually get in. Sometimes people call when they're in the hospital because it's a way of also getting out of the hospital. The hospitals might discharge you if they know you have a place to go. So I went there. There was basic food in the house, but I could walk. They have a supermarket and a food co-op within walking distance. If I wanted to get the food that I like, I can bring that in there. And for me in that moment, when things were really difficult, I could ask for support that I needed. And at the time, I would forget to eat or drink. And so I could ask people, can you just, when you see me, ask me that? And that's my request. That's what I need for support. Can you remind me? With the psych drugs, sometimes they throw off your ability to know when you're thirsty. And I kind of had lost that, and it had given me problems with my electrolytes and my heartbeat. And so it can be really different. Somebody stay there can be very different depending on what somebody's looking. For me, it was usually helpful to spend a lot of time alone and quiet, but then it was also a blessing to be able to wake up at any time and have somebody willing to engage in conversation with me. And this was like really different than any hospital stay, because it was really around their schedule of when they think you should eat, drink, and sleep. And the respite, I get to figure out when eating, drinking, and sleeping makes sense for me. Within the town of Northampton, we were also offering alternatives to suicide groups. So there were outside things I could go to. I can remember having my kids come visit me, and sitting in the huge backyard and doing that. So visits can be really different. If somebody's at work, school, has appointments, they have social connections, they can maintain those. And that's basically what it's like.
Cindy, that's a great description. It really is. And one thing I heard is you can come and go. You can go to the supermarket. You're not locked up. Is the point. Yeah. Next, Vic, you mentioned a little bit that there was one effort at a respite house there that sort of failed, and then you redid it. So from this point of view of how to make a house successful, what have you learned? I mean, what are some of the keys to avoiding pitfalls that led to the first one being closed? And what did you learn from that to make it successful the second time? Because again, part of the summit is people coming going like, oh, maybe we can start a respite house. So what have you learned that you can communicate to the audience on this question of what are pitfalls and what are the sort of ways to success?
Well, in this particular situation, the things on the ground were going really well. It was a lesson in choosing correct leadership if you're part of a nonprofit structure. And I think that could be a whole nother webinar. What does effective board leadership look like? What does it mean to have people in leadership positions who truly understand and support what respites look like? Even if we all have lived experience related to mental health, we still come at it from different points of view. So I think in creating Monarch House and the nonprofit umbrella for that, which is called Wisconsin Milkweed Alliance, we started with what are the core values of the organization. And there was a group of us who had formed a similar organization that was not a nonprofit. And so we had that to start with. We already have this kind of working set of shared values and starting place from there. And so as we create this new project, we want to stay grounded in these values that include self-determination, holding everyone in high regard, and being committed to transformation of ourselves and the wider culture and community. And you know, when you have that starting point of, yes, we're not going to be looking at rules and regulations and policies so much as what are the shared values that we want to come back to when we encounter difficult situations.
I think that's a little bit of an important message here. You need organizational strength behind this. That has to be in place a little bit when you set up your house. That there is there's a way of making decisions, shared values. I mean, that sounds like a message for people. Get your organizational strong right from the beginning. All right, great.
Yes,
Roslyn,
and I would add just what briefly also, yeah, know that difficulties and conflict will happen, and have a plan in place for how are we going to engage when that does happen. You know, because this is hard work.
Yeah.
This, you know, we're presenting this kind of very idealistic, you know, hope for what this could all look like under the best of circumstances. And the reality is that human beings are human beings. And we come at it with our own histories of hurt and our own less than ideal ways of coping with conflict and struggles. And so how do we create a shared commitment to work together in the midst of those hard things that come up?
well, I'm pretty sure those are challenges to almost any organization. Anytime you have a group of people together, it can be challenges for sure. Roslyn, you're the director of a state peer-run services, and you have 5 underneath you. So the question, and you can see where I'm going to be going here with this. How do you expand from 1, which is great, but how do you begin to expand it? What are you learning about it so it becomes more available to a larger group of people? In Georgia, you have 5. I guess they're a little bit different. So tell us about the challenges and how you've managed to start to expand this type of, you know, whatever you want to call it, opportunity, help, that sort of thing.
Currently, we have 4, I'll say 4.5. And the situation is this: in Georgia, several years ago, we opened in 2008. So right around that time, the state of Georgia was sued by the Department of Justice because, you know, the services for people experiencing mental health challenges were really poor. And Georgia still ranks like maybe number 49 in the country when it comes to services, behavioral health services. However, when this lawsuit happened, the idea was, you know, the state of Georgia, you must do better and you must put money into, you know, different services and moving people out of hospitals into community. And so when this happened and this money became available, my boss, Sherry Jenkins Tucker, and Jamie Lynch, who was the first director of the Decatur Peer Support and Wellness Center, Jamie was familiar with Respite. And so they did a research, you know, they did a travel tour and research and everything and came up with this idea to open a respite center. And it was just, you know, that perfect timing when everything came together and the funds were there. And so we are funded through a contract with our Georgia Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities. And what that allows us to do is really, really focus on peer support because we don't have any Medicaid involvement or anything like that. So we don't have to write notes on folks or anything like that. So we can really do peer support. And, you know, our first center was very successful. And from that success, you know, and from people in communities, we want a respite center. How do we get a respite center? Oh, this is the best thing ever. How do we get one? You know, and so where there was interest, you know, we said, okay, you know, Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities, you know, can we have money to open another one? And so it kind of happened that way. Last year or 2 years ago when the pandemic hit, and there was, you know, we took some serious budget cuts as an organization. And as a result of that, we lost one of our respites. And since then, we got money restored, and we're in the process of opening another one in another city in Atlanta. And so that we're in that process. That's why I said 4.5. And so the funding is always, that's the biggest question. How do we get this thing started, and where do we get the money? You know, that's a huge question. And like I said, we were fortunate to have this contract. So, but it's a year-to-year contract. And so if for some reason they decide, you know, that money could better be used elsewhere, we're always at risk of having, you know, having that taken away. Interesting for us is we've rented properties to do this work. And here recently with the center that we're going to open, or that we're in the process of opening in Augusta, Georgia, we were actually gifted a property. And so it was the first thing that, you know, piece of property that the Georgia Mental Health Consumer Network actually owns. And so, you know, there's, you know, that's a gift and a curse, you know, because we got to pay the taxes and fix the roof and do all those things. So it's expensive. And it's a blessing, you know, to be able to own this. And, you know, if the state says we're pulling out, you know, we're developing those community relationships to be able to continue to function. And so it's definitely been an interesting journey. And when we talk to people, you know, the opportunity to not have to write notes, to not have to bill, and to not do all of those things is huge. And it really allows us to support people in a way that I think, you know, peer support that's in a clinical setting, you know, doesn't happen. And I hope I answered the question.
No, that's really important. I think that it's not within the clinical setting,
Yeah.
but it's outside of clinical setting. And then we got about 10 minutes left, but I have one real quick question for you, Roslyn. Is there any, since you get state funding, is there any curbs on how you can do it? You know, you don't have to write notes and stuff, but are there any sort of restrictions on your freedom and your how you run it because there's state money?
No, I mean, we are able, pretty much the way Cindy described, you know, folks come in, we call it a model introduction. Our door is not locked during the day. You don't need to have an appointment. You can just walk in and say, hey, you know, I'm here, tell me about this place. And, you know, we welcome you in and tell you all about us. And, you know, from there, you're able to participate. Now, something that's probably different about our centers than some others is that we offer wellness activities in-house, and we also operate a warm line in-house. And so it's not just respite. And so folks who come, so daily participation happens like between the hours of 10 and 6. Folks can come in, use computers, participate in activities and those types of things. And then, like I said, we have respite running at the same time. And so there are activities available for people who are in respite if they want to participate. You know, if they don't want to participate, fine. We take folks grocery shopping, or right now we let them, you know, do Instacart to pick out the food that they want. People, you know, there is a curfew, but it's like indicators like at 2 a.m., you know, so people really have a lot of freedom to do and determine what it is that they want and need for their own wellness. And so we do have a lot of flexibility. There are some things that, you know, we might like to do differently, but, you know, when we wrote up the original contract and these are the things that were agreed to, you know, you kind of locked into that. And so we're looking with the center that we're opening in Augusta to being able to expand and do things a little bit differently based on, you know, the lessons that we've learned with our other centers up to this point.
Two last quick questions. One is the question of meds, because of course in conventional care, if you go into a psychiatric hospital, meds are going to generally come with it, often in a sort of a forced way. How do you all manage the question of meds? Does it come up much, or how is that part of what's going on?
Is part of what's going on only if somebody makes it part of it, what's going on. We do not pass out meds. We don't hold meds. Each room has a little safe. If people choose to share they're taking medication, they can share that, but we're not asking. You know, our assumption is that somebody coming in is an adult and can figure out, you know, we're there to support them to figure out what it is that they want to do. And we're not going to play this control or policing role.
Is it-
We have a similar point of view with Monarch House. And I think that's part of the reason why, we call our respite a home-like setting. And so part of that expectation is if you were coming to stay at someone's home, your host would not be going through your bags or asking you about your medical routine. We have a conversation when folks are first, exploring whether or not they want to come stay, and name that we have that expectation that you are able to care for your own basic needs in terms of taking medication if you have it, and providing for your own, basic bodily needs. And again, just trusting, like Cindy mentioned, that everyone is an adult and we want to treat people with as much respect and autonomy as possible.
Yep. What Cindy and Vic said, it's their business. If they want to talk about it, we talk about it. I don't know what medication anybody is taking. I don't know what anybody's diagnosis is, because that's just not the focus of our interactions. We have a black box and trust people to do what they need to do to take care of themselves.
Last question. This has been great, by the way. You guys have been really good. And I'm pretty sure the audience is probably wrapped with attention. Where do we, and I'm going to use the word we because all of society, I think, benefits from respite houses. Where do we go from here? I mean, it's great what you're doing, but I heard 3 beds here, 1 bed here, 3 beds here. And these are big populations. And a lot of people aren't having access to respite houses and are still getting, carted off to ERs and forcibly treated and having trouble even breathing fresh air and that sort of thing. So how do we take these little seeds of difference and change? What's your vision for making this more available, more central to how people can, find help, find a respite, find some better way forward? That's a big question, and you each have about 2-3 minutes, 2 minutes. All right, whoever wants to go first.
I'll take a try at this. And I want to draw back on what you drew on earlier about the Quaker model and those religious communities. And I think there is a lot to be learned without repeating the mistakes of the past. But my vision would be every community having a respite, and whether that could be a converted church building or parsonage or some sort of collective space that is not necessarily tied to state funds or grant funds, but just a community good of, just like we think that it's important to have a fire department.
That's a good analogy.
We think it's important to fund a community respite center so that when members of our community are struggling and need a break, we can provide that for them in whatever way makes sense for the unique needs of our particular community.
That's quite a beautiful vision. Cindy, and I guess Cindy then Roslyn.
Well, I'm a little jaded. So where I go with this is money, all right? That peer respite is such a far more affordable option. And that, the people who are worried about money and what money goes where, it really makes a lot of sense to, and there is, some amount of research behind it, how much money is saved. When we do a voluntary survey at the end of somebody's stay, and we do these annual surveys, people report not going inpatient as often. They report, not, now that I have this safety valve place to go when things get hard or weird, I'm not ending up in these really expensive services. And sometimes insurance companies can be persuaded to actually fund things without control because they know it's going to save them money in the long run. And so hopefully states and other people who figure out where to throw money can figure out this will actually save the money.
I don't know, you guys know this better than I, but I think I saw somewhere like a day in a psychiatric hospital costs more than $1,000. And your price price, it's like $300 or $350 a day. So that is an argument that often legislators will actually listen to. Humanistic one doesn't get them, you can get them with the financial one. Roslyn, last words on this. How are we going to make this available to population at large?
Again, I agree with everything that Vic and Cindy said. And I think education is really important, and people really understanding. We're here to learn about it, and we get the value of it. But people outside of our community, do they understand what we're doing and how it works? I remember when we first opened the Respite Center in Decatur, or the stories, the community was not happy. They put up a blog about us, and said, we got these pedophiles in the neighborhood, and just all of these terrible things about having a respite in the community. And it went so far, the whole not in my backyard thing, that it ended up in a legal battle, and we were able to win and stay in the neighborhood. And since that time, we've proven ourselves to be good neighbors, and actually have been designated the safe house in this community, where at first, they were, the boogeyman is living next door to us. And so really, I'm throwing out that word stigma, but what and discrimination, just what people, their idea about who we are, and what we're doing. And speaking to that, and speaking out loud, and showing up for recovery and saying, hey, look at me, I'm one of those people that you would have, just discarded, and here I am, and I'm doing great things, in my life and for people in the community. And so I think that education piece, and continuing to work to really change hearts and minds, and that's difficult, but if people could get it, then they'd recognize what a great investment it is, and we could have one in every community, because the communities want them. People who get it want it. People who don't get it, are like, no, not in my backyard. And so, finding ways to bridge that gap, to kind of get everybody on board, I think would make it a lot easier for Peer Respites to grow. I see all the email lists and everything. Oh, we're having this fight. Our local government says this or that. They won't fund this, or they want to control that. And how in the world can we trust a bunch of folks, with no clinical person in charge? We can't do that. That's dangerous. And so being able to change, continuing to work to change those ideas, and again, to bridge that gap, so that then, the pockets would open up a bit, and we could really, expand and have a greater impact with respites.
So those were great answers, really great. I think as a start to this 5-week seminar, couldn't have been better. What you guys have really presented, you three have presented, is really a beautiful vision of what is possible. Now, it's now 1:30 when we said we'd come back. And first of all, welcome back, everyone. We'll have about 45 minutes to discuss Soteria projects, and then there'll be about 45 minutes for Q&A from the audience, okay? And I basically like this to go as we did with the first one, with each of you taking about 5 minutes to introduce yourself. We have Voice Hendricks here. Voice was the project director, or the person who was at the house for really directing the house for 12 years when the original Soteria ran. Remy helped start Soteria Israel, and was basically the lead person there for a number of years, right? I mean, in terms of the directing the operations there. And Katie, you ran Soteria Vermont for a number of years, is that correct?
Yeah, 5 years.
5 years. So we have people with a lot of experience here. So I'm gonna start with, in about 5 minutes each, just introduce yourself and your involvement with this whole subject of Soteria project. So Voice, why don't we start with you, since you're probably more well-known than anybody else in the Soteria world. So Voice Hendricks, who ran the original Soteria project starting in 1971.
Okay, I'm Voice Hendricks. Was the original clinical director, was probably the role I played most at Soteria for the most probably about, out of the 13 years, probably about 8 years of that, I was clinical director, which means I was the director of Soteria House and director of the Emanon of the second Soteria House, and then there's several other projects in between. But Soteria itself is probably my most involved part of the project itself. So it's much more complicated than just the Soteria House itself. Again, you think about me, I started my first, probably until I was 25, no, actually more like 30 when I actually started working at Soteria. I saw myself as more of an athlete and a musician. Had nothing to do with mental health at all. As an athlete, I was in high school. I don't sound like I'm bragging, but I was the one state. I
think we lost voice there for a second, right? It's not just my end. Voice may not know we lost him. I think what I'll do oh, here comes voice. We lost you there for a second.
Oh, okay.
You were talking about being an athlete in high school, and something. I think you won state. So, and then we lost you. So we can go back to.
Yeah. Again, I saw myself more as an athlete when I went to college on a sports scholarship. My major was music, so I wound up, after leaving college, actually being drafted in the Army for 2 years. I came back and pretty much was a professional musician, playing in nightclubs and Las Vegas and on tour a lot. So that's how I identified myself. The reason why I became involved in mental health was when I was on the road traveling. I woke up one night and realized that I had no idea where I was and what I was doing. My life didn't make any sense. And my girlfriend at the time worked at a state hospital in Porterville, California. There, anytime I wanted. So I quit my musician's job and became a psych technician for the state hospital, which essentially was like an RN, a nurse working in with people who are mentally ill. And so, and that hospital was literally, the name of it was the Porterville State Hospital for the Mental Retarded. So you can imagine what that was like. I worked there for a year and transferred to Agnew State Hospital. It's another state hospital. I transferred to a hospital that was for the mentally ill. It was dramatically different than the Porterville State Hospital. In fact, for me, it was like kind of a humane place where people sincerely thought they were doing good work, and really, some really good people in terms of working with it. And I saw myself as someone who was doing something wonderful, working with people who were sick. It didn't take very long there to realize what I was doing didn't make a lot of sense, even though my role was kind of defined. I tend to wind up in places where other people don't go. And I wound up on the admission suite where I find myself being called every time anything happened in the hospital, conflict. The on admission suite, people would be called to support the crisis. And I developed this reputation of being able to deal with people in crisis in a way that brought the tension down, not escalated, wanting people in seclusion. And so I was a popular person called. As soon as some crisis happened, I tended to call. And so my role became established sort of hospital-wide, and I got to know pretty much everybody, and was sort of defined differently at the hospital. The other part of that, being in that role, that you got to see the hospital in its full, in the full sense. The other thing that happened at the end of my stay there, that the thing you talked about, the Rappaport study, was happening. And I got sort of intensely involved in that program, even though they wouldn't let me work there. I was sort of asked to come over and help when crisis happened. So I got to know everybody on that unit. And suddenly I saw a whole different way of interacting, and the whole issue of medication versus non-medication became a serious question in my head. The other thing that is important about me.
Boyce, let me stop you here just in terms of time. That's a great place to stop because it tells us what Warren Moshe used to say about you, actually, that you had the right way of being. You mentioned that would be so adaptive to what he was hoping Soteria Project would be. So I think that's a great way to stop here just for a second, because you've explained, or we can see now why you would have been the person to choose, to be, quote, the director of this project. So I'm just going to stop you there. That was a great introduction. Let's go to Katie. Tell us, Katie, about how you came with Soteria Vermont, when it started, a little bit about that, and about 5 minutes if you can, and yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I just have a few notes here to read from for the time frame. So I've been doing peer support for about a decade now, and I've worked with folks that are criminally or psychiatrically incarcerated during that time. I've worked with Pathways Vermont for almost 10 years in some capacity too. So when I started at Pathways Vermont, I worked with the Housing First program for 4 years, and then I was the Soteria manager for 5 years up until this summer. I also managed the Pathways Vermont peer support line and community center. So just a little background about me. In college, I was put on 10 different medications my junior year, including antipsychotics, which was my introduction to the medical model. I was on psychiatric medication for 10 years in some fashion, and I've been off of all psychiatric medication now for 4 years. I feel that my work at Soteria actually really inspired my choice to come off medication. I was consistently in a space and supporting and creating a space where this was accepted and seen as possible. And also just echoing what I heard a lot of other folks saying earlier around, asking what's happened to me, versus what's wrong with me. I have an extensive trauma history that was never explored. And instead of exploring, I was told to mute my feelings with medication. My distress was seen as problematic instead of a human response to some really challenging circumstances. I do want to just say that in sharing my story, and also just from the Soteria perspective, that we're pro-choice and options, and we see medication as a tool, but just strongly feel that it shouldn't be the first line of support. And then Soteria had been around for about a year when I started in my role. So I think, I was very involved in the growth of the project for the last 5 years. I just want to say too that Soteria being part of Pathways Vermont is really integral to its success. And Pathways Vermont trains all of its direct service staff in intentional peer support, which I heard a lot of shout outs to that earlier. And I think Chris Hansen and Sherry Mead are here today. So thank you for all of your work. And I think IPS really has been a foundation for how peer support is practiced at Soteria. And yeah, I'll stop there and get more into Soteria shortly. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks, Katie. Remy, tell us a little bit about yourself and your involvement in starting Soteria Israel, and later on we'll talk about how it's expanded since those initial houses. But tell us a little bit about yourself and how Soteria Israel got started.
Okay, so I am Avraham Friedlander. I live in Israel. I can't believe, but I am married almost 18 years, and I have 6 children that make me crazy, but I still love them. 16 years ago, I had a spiritual event episode. The doctors in that time called it a psychotic, catatonic psychotic episode. And I was forcibly hospitalized and for less than 24 hours, but it was my horrible 24 hours in my life. It was like a hell for me. Before that, I didn't know what is psychiatry. I didn't know the word psychiatry. That was the first time I met therapists or psychiatrists, and I didn't believe that in the 20s, that's how people treat people that suffers. So I swear that when I will go out from the hospital, I will try to do things different. And I started to learn psychology. And today I am a clinic psychology in practice, and also I am writing now my PhD on alternatives for for psychiatric hospitalizations. The doctor that forced me to get inside the hospital was Professor Pesach Lichtenberg. In that time, in 2006, he was a head minister of a regular ward in the hospital. And after 6 years, when I learned my first degree in psychology, I looked for a place to volunteer. And I thought maybe I will go back to the ward that they hospitalized me. And when I came back to the ward, it was very hard for me to volunteer there, to be a part of the staff. And I started to behave there like Patch Adams. And all the it was very hard for the staff to handle with me. I took patients from the hospital out, like 6 or 10 people out of the ward, and we were like walking out the streets. And when we came back, I took the key. It was horrible. I took the key and gave them the key to open the doors. That was a big, big mistake. And when they took patients inside the isolation room, I begged them to bring me inside, to be with them inside the isolation room. And I begged them to take them out from the isolation room, that I can handle with them and they don't need to be in the isolation room. And all the mess that I made in the ward, after not long time, they told me that the head minister want to talk to me. And all my life, I know when the head minister wants to talk to me, it's not for good things. It's a 1 minute before they telling me, they show me the door again, tell me, okay, you can find your another place. And then I talked to Professor Pesach Lichtenberg, first time after what I met him 6 years ago when I was hospitalized there. And he says that he liked what I'm doing. And he told me about his dream to open a Soteria model in Israel. And from then it's a history. We started to talk and we started to work together. 10 years, we thought how to open a Soteria in Israel. Everybody said, wow, it's a wonderful idea, but nobody helped us to open it. We talked to the Ministry of Health, we talked to the HMOs, and everybody said it's a wonderful idea, but nobody took it down. And in 2016, thanks to a radio broadcaster, I think that's a word, she talked all the time about tying patients in the isolation room, and all the media talked about it, how it's wrong, and everybody to talk that we cannot keep doing those stuff to treat people like that. And we took this opportunity and we had more courage, and we thought that we need now to to get it open, to open the first Soteria in Israel. In the first, we didn't get permissions from the country. We opened it like half pirates.
So Remy, I'm going to stop you there because that's a good stopping point, because now it also brings this question of how you, like voice, how you came to this moment. And if you listen to the first part, the first part was about peer run initiatives. So people who had been in the system and have that experience, wanting a very different conception, very different way of helping each other, and peer run. So they Soteria is different in the sense that it came from within the original Soteria project came from within the psychiatric establishment. I mean, Lauren Mosher was head of schizophrenia studies, so its origins were very different. And it really was a different type of clinical is probably the wrong word, but a different type of systemic care, that's why it was an experiment. And it was an experiment related to drugs, not immediately putting people on antipsychotics. Runs for 10 years. It actually shows better outcomes, but it was a protocol in a way of medication use and having a supportive environment, being with. There are a lot of the same conceptions, but nevertheless, it was supposed to be, here's a type of care that would produce better outcomes, okay? And in sort of the history of psychiatry, it's almost like a dividing line. We could have gone down one route, we went down the other. So it's now 2021. Each of you have had experiences, but I'd like to go back to voice. And voice, you had 11 years of experience. If either Remy or Katie had come to you 5 years ago, what advice would you give them about starting and running a Soteria project today in the modern times? What's different? What made it possible for you to operate in the way you did in 1970, but it's now 2020? And what advice would you give them around antipsychotics? Now, that's a big question. I'm going to ask you to try to answer that in 5 minutes. And then I have a question for Remy and a question for Katie. But the big question is, you experienced something, had selective use of antipsychotics. What would you tell people today in terms of how to start a Soteria today?
I think it's probably more relevant to the approach that is to talk about what was going on in Soteria, how Soteria began itself, to understand the time that Soteria existed, because it's very difficult for me to tell you how, because I don't know what's going on pretty much in the field, because I retired for at least 15 years. But if you think about Soteria San Jose happened in 1974. There was no family groups, there was no peers groups, there was the state hospital had just dumped everybody in the community, and there was no model how to take care of people in the community. They were what we call halfway houses. We're just some family or some agency hiring a couple people off the street to hang out in his house, and the sort of, they were called flop houses and stuff like that. And most of them were around this University of San Jose State University. So it was very difficult to sort of define. You're doing essentially doing an alternative to state hospitals, not alternative to the mental health system, because there was no mental health system at that point. And so what we found, and if you think about Soteria, the original Soteria, actually the first 6 months of Soteria was total chaos. We had 3 weeks to get ourselves together before our first resident arrived at the front door. So in our experience at that point, we were totally unaware of what we were doing. We had no concept of what was going to happen. We had all these different ideas. We spent time with the union, the society. They were doing training. We spent 3 days in Esalen Institute, and we had all of the experts there talk to us about psychosis and all the stuff. At that point, it also was the DSM-2, the instrument that determined the language. So they're talking about neurotics and all this stuff. So all the stuff you're talking about now in the community stuff didn't exist. So when we start, like I said, when the first person came in the door, now when I think about it, I feel kind of sorry for her because we just essentially, she came in and we just hung out. Essentially hung out for 2 weeks, and she was running around. One of the most, if you using the language of the time, psychotic person that I've experienced in my field. By then, I've worked like 7 or 8 years in the hospital. So I worked at the most intense part of the hospital. So I'm not talking about someone who's just experienced some problems, someone who's going, and you could not communicate in a logical way with her, but I can describe her as fun. We had the first 2 days was just, everybody was pretty much at the house all the time. You have to understand 4 people that we call staff actually lived in the house at that time. So it's hard to describe what Soteria was at that point. It took us about 1.5 years to evolve into a system. And that at the point where I became director and realized that we wouldn't survive if we didn't create some way of being with people in an environment that we took care of all of us, because the staff was burnt out and it wouldn't survive. Even though the research showed the outcomes of the people who had gone through it was actually far, the research showed that people went through the system and had better outcomes than they did if you look at the research later on. Through all that chaos, they had better. And so I don't know how to explain that. The Hawthorne effect, I think you talk about in research. But the point is, at this point, what we did, evolved and created something. What people now do with Soteria is what I see happening is I'm impressed with people that are doing it. Katie would probably be a better person to explain how to do that. And
Boyce, that's a great segue, because what you identified at least a common principle here across times, and that is the idea of being with people and not doing things to people. And that's sort of a central part of the difference, obviously. So I'm going to go ahead and jump to Katie. I think you said Vermont Soteria started in 2012. And what I'd like you to do, Katie, is in what ways have you modeled, in what ways was Soteria Vermont modeled on the original sort of way of doing things? And in what ways is it different? And if you could also do talk about the use of antipsychotics, because in the original version, that was a critical part of the experiment. It was run as an experiment. So
yeah, sure. Thanks. Yeah, so I think, the original Soteria was the inspiration. So I think we tried to model it after that as much as possible, and also just acknowledging the difference in times. So Soteria Vermont was created would have been 2015. Yeah, and it followed actually the state of Vermont hospital in Waterbury flooding. So that flooded and kind of prompted the state of Vermont to consider alternatives, and Soteria Vermont was born. And so I think our initial intake process we try to have that be as similar to the original Soteria as possible. So we look for folks, we actually don't require diagnostic criteria for somebody to come into the program. And we also don't bill for services. So it's completely grant funded. And we're looking for folks that are medication naive and have minimal hospitalizations. That's what we're looking for. I would just say that's kind of hard to find sometimes. So unfortunately, folks still end up funneled through the mainstream system. A lot of times they've at least had an emergency room visit, and hopefully we can get them from the emergency room. But usually, even just with the way the system works, when folks end up in the emergency room in Vermont, they're emergency evaluated and often end up at least with a short hospitalization before being able to get referred to us. But ideally, we're getting the community referrals and kind of adhering to that original philosophy as much as possible. And then just in terms of the being with, we have different ways of being with people. So we have like an intensive being with. So the first, it changed a little with COVID, unfortunately, just because folks had to come in and actually isolate for 2 weeks, which was just really wild to be dealing with, just to name that out loud. But typically it was usually 1 week of intensive being with. So with somebody pretty much all the time, unless they wanted some space in their room or obviously in the bathroom. And that was changed during COVID more to like at least 2 to sometimes 3 weeks. Because when somebody came into the program, we weren't able to have as much time with them, just because of the forced isolatory period. But yeah, so intensive being with, and then being with, just casual being with throughout the rest of the program, unless somebody was in a really heightened state. And then we'd go back to the like intensive being with process, which really looks like you're literally sitting with somebody, sometimes 24/7. I mean, giving people space in the bathroom, but being able to sit with people in their rooms. And I think just to say, it's kind of challenging to describe being with because it's so unique to each person. So, we have sometimes people that are in really heightened states where we're literally just, we talk about how it's not really following somebody, but that person might kind of perceive it that way. Somebody just kind of running out of the house and us running after them and just really trying to be with them, or somebody that might be really withdrawn, in their room, and we're trying to bring them food in their room and kind of coax them to come out into the community. So that can look, I just want to say that out loud, that can look like very different depending on the person. Is this answering your question, Bob?
No, it is. And actually, I think what's interesting is actually there was a certain fidelity to, one of the thoughts with Soteria was if you get people early on and direct them into a different path,
Mhm.
isn't a chronic path, isn't a path of lifelong use of antipsychotics. There's this moment of opportunity, especially with medication naive people and all, and to send people down a different path, a different long-term path. And I'm impressed with how the effort was to be faithful to the original idea of early on, even medication naive people.
Yeah.
Real quickly, and then I want to go to Remy. Have you had any Voice began to talk about outcomes. I had mentioned something with longer term outcomes. Have you had a chance to look at your outcomes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, asking you.
Yeah, and then
we're-
we'll go to you, Remy, because I know you do the research too. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so we, the state of Vermont, just to say, actually requires all therapeutic community residences usually to do something called a locus survey. And we actually were able to move away from having to do any of that required, which I'm really grateful for. Instead, we do self-assessment surveys. So we do want to intake, midpoint, and exit. The problem with the self-assessment surveys, though, is that we found that they're often still really feelings-based. So one example I commonly give is we had somebody who had actually been on some medications when they came into the program and came off their medications while they were in the program, and described the process as feeling like there were nails being ripped out of their brain. So when they talked about the feelings that they had at the time of leaving, they were still in a really intense place, right? But they were still better than when they came in. So sometimes those feelings-based questions don't really get at the crux of kind of the qualitative story that somebody would just tell you. So we actually started looking at more like qualitative like research versus quantitative research, and how we started doing that was through our storytelling. So we actually did a bunch of video stories. We had a video project series that we did where we interviewed residents and had them tell their stories. And then as I was leaving, I left Soteria this past summer. We started looking at building scales to measure resiliency, which I was really, that's kind of where I was at right when I was leaving. And I talked to them recently and they're still trying to do like resiliency scale assessments versus, which are still self-based, to try to look at somebody's like resiliency upon leaving the program versus necessarily like just how they're feeling. That's such a like hard thing to measure. Yeah.
So from your stories, real quickly,
Yeah.
you feel people tell stories of finding it helpful,
Oh, definitely.
seeing them
Yes.
change their life.
Yeah. And some of the stories are on the Pathways Vermont website. I don't think all of them are, but we did like a whole video project series where we interviewed people to have them share about their experiences.
So maybe someone can put that link in the chat room so people can read some of those stories. Remy, one of the things that's interesting is when you mention Pesach, is that Pesach was a prescriber, much like Lauren Mosher. He's a psychiatrist. So, and I believe he might have met Lauren. Didn't he meet Lauren at one point? I'm not sure. But the point is that the origins from that part, you talked about him, but there was the origins from a psychiatrist wanting to do something different as well. So tell us about how you modeled your first house there in Jerusalem and how close you were modeling it after the original Soteria project and how you adapted it to modern times and to Israel.
Yeah, of course, the Soteria model, we spirit from the Soteria model, but from the beginning, we want that the government and the community will accept us. So from the beginning, we all the time thought how we can, how the government will accept us. And the first big problem is medication. Because if you put in the front that you are with no medication, so they put X on you. So we said all the time, we are regular. What the difference from us to the regular system is two things. One, we don't force nothing. We only can say that if you want, we can give you medication. And second thing, in the same thing, that shared decision making. We're not telling nobody what we think your treatment should be. So that was the first thing, how we wanted to show us in the community that they won't kick us out. And the second thing, we cannot be like the first Soteria with only 6 residents and for 3 to 6 months, because we know that the HMOs will never funded us if it will be so long. So from the beginning, we tried to put it on like 1.5 months, that in the future, the HMOs will accept us. And except this, we try to be like the original model.
And real quickly, you're doing research now, you personally. Are you charting outcomes with, now, first of all, how many Soteria houses or like Soteria houses are operating in Israel now?
Wow. And first of all, I want to say that after 1 year, in 2017, the Ministry of Health recognized us and accept the Soteria model in Israel. And in 2019, the HMOs started to funded us. And from 2019, we had two houses. And when that HMOs started to funded us, now we have in Israel 12 houses like Soteria that the HMOs funded all the houses, and citizens in Israel can get a Soteria house for free.
Wow. You know, when you say this, it's almost like what's happening in Israel is what Lauren Moshe was hoping would happen and Bush was happening 50 years ago, what happened in the United States. So, I mean, where it becomes a regular part of care. Real quickly on outcomes, then I have a question for all of you, and then we're going to have to open up the questions. So what sort of outcomes are you seeing? And the reason I'm using this word outcomes is because Soteria did come within an environment where people talk about outcomes. And the idea was to provide better outcomes. So it is part of the language of the Soteria history is outcomes. So what are you finding?
So I'm in the start of my research, but I have outcomes in first outcomes. First of all, it's about self stigma that we see that very interesting thing that we have the same residents like the hospital, like an open word, not like a closed word, with the same symptoms, the same distress. But from the beginning in our house, the self stigma is less, and when in the end of the time, it's they get more lesser than what happened in the hospital. So that's the first outcome that for me, I think it's very important. Second outcomes, very interesting, about the correlation between therapeutic aliens to take down symptoms. In the hospital, there is no correlations. It doesn't mind if you have big therapeutic aliens or less therapeutic aliens with your therapist or with your doctor. You have no correlation between therapeutic aliens to outcomes, to less symptoms. And in Soteria, you have a big correlation that you see that as more that the people feel therapeutic aliens with a house or with a staff, more he gets down the symptoms after the time he is in the house. But in the end, the less symptoms are the same between Soteria and the hospital, but I'm checking for 1.5 and 3 years up in follow-up. So I still don't have the outcomes for the long time. I have also another little outcome that I will finish about rehospitalizations, also in Soteria or in the hospital. And we checked our residents from 2018, and we are now following up for 2 and 3 years. And we see that in the Soteria residents have less rehospitalizations, less number of hospitalizations, and less days in hospital or in Soteria in the long way.
I'm going to ask each of you one last question, and then we'll open it up. I remember Lauren telling me how much she enjoyed being with people in the Soteria House and often unmedicated. And I remember Pesach telling me something similar. So I'm going to start with voice. If you can recall some sort of experience you had that you recall as one of the most rewarding ones for you personally, in terms of your being with someone, what sort of anecdote would you tell about a sort of, did you have a sense of joy at times with working with some of the people, being with some of the people? And is there an anecdote that really springs to life? You're muted here right now, boys. Got to unmute.
I thought somebody muted me. I thought it was going to be unmuted. You realize this is a difficult question because most of my experience with Soteria was actually great. I mean, it was life and, raising the experience itself. 13 years, you're talking about 200 people in terms of going through here. There's so many events that were positive.
We're losing him again.
House itself, and since the relationships continue, and one of the perfect examples going to be Burton Mooney, who's going to be, I think, here next week. That we may not have contacted each other once a year, but pretty much every year, if not every other year, and since that in with the 50 years since Soteria was on, we still involved with, that relation. We have a relationship. I mean, I know, he's now has 2 kids that have graduated to college and stuff. I know all about his life, and so there's so much of that. It's pretty hard to define any one particular thing. It's sort of a global thing.
But Voice, the point is you enjoyed it. It was life enhancing for you.
Yeah, it was, but it also, I mean, there's a lot of burnout with that.
Yeah.
So there's 2 sides of it. But in terms of and who I am, there's a term that I used to use, not so much at Soteria, but with my professor, a term called Imbutu, which means I think it's part of the Zulu language. It's a word that implies I am me because you. So I am me because of the people I interact with. Soteria, I am me because a lot of it is because of Soteria and the people I interact with. So you think about it that way. If it wasn't for Soteria, I would not be the same person at all.
So this is,
so you have to think about it that way.
No, I think that's beautiful, Voice. I mean, I think one of the things to talk about here is you often hear from people working, and Remy mentioned this, in traditional settings, getting incredibly, filled with despair and not liking what they're doing. And then when you talk about people in these other settings, it's a two-way street. I mean, people feel very rewarded in some way, even though if it's difficult and burnout. I often hear about how rewarding it was. And as we sort of discuss here as this possibility, I think one of the things to think about is this can be a more rewarding place for everybody, not just quote the residents. Katie, sort of the same question. How did you find it? Is there some memory in particular that speaks to the joy that can come from this, the pleasure, or life transformation that Voice spoke about?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I really love being with people that are in kind of non-consensus reality states. And I think one of the things that I learned over my time there was just how unique each person's experience is. And I think in the medical model, we really try to compartmentalize people into this kind of like mold of one size fits all. And that's not the case. That's not the case at all for people that are going through these extreme experiences. And there's so much beauty into learning about the person and getting to understand where they came from, what happened to them, where they're at. We have, I think some of my most intense memories are a lot of the property destruction. I mean, we had a whole room, the ceiling was completely torn out. We had somebody that was trying to set a fire with electrical wires, and we're still navigating that experience, so some pretty intense moments of being with people. And I do want to say some of my memories, are once obviously somebody's in the house and then we're being with them in the community and, taking them into the forest and that kind of thing. But, one of my favorite moments was actually when I went to somebody's parents' house and I sat with this young person in their bedroom for hours and convinced them to come to Soteria. And the being with started before they got there, and I would say that it really worked before, the parents were like, this person's going to go to the hospital or they're going to Soteria. And I spent hours with them and finally convinced them to get in my car and come to the Soteria House. And I just want to highlight that like being with can happen. And I truly believe should be happening everywhere with people. And there's power to that. So. Yeah, I have so many examples, Bob, I could give you. So that's.
I just want, before we turn it over, I just want to say that Soteria, from everything I've understood, it can be a better place to be for those who are, quote, staff as well than compared to a hospital. I think that's the point. Now, when I visited Remy, I had the joy of meeting someone who introduced himself as God, who also ran a WhatsApp group. And so I said to this person, I don't speak Hebrew. And he told me, don't worry, God translates, which was fantastic. So Remy, the same question for you now. I don't know how many years you're there, but how did it change you? What joys did you find? what did you receive, so to speak, by being in Soteria?
It's very complex because in Israel, Soteria, it's not only for people that are in a psychotic episode. So sometimes people are very also in psychotic episode, but other people are very stressed and it's very harmful for them and it's very hard for them. So it's not enjoying to be with a person that suffers. So it can be very hard to be with a person that suffers, but it's not all the time what we see. And sometimes people are manic, or sometimes people are playing. So it can be also very enjoying. And for me, to be with a person, it's a big gift that I can get from somebody. To be with him, to like to be with like a symbiosis, to be like with him, to feel him, to be like him. I feel like I'm getting inside him, he's getting inside me, and the mix that we're together. And then after I can see after 1 week, 2 weeks, how he's like a flower starting to get out from the place that he was. I think it's the best gift that a person can get in that world.
Well, thank you all, you three, so much. This, I think, as the start of a 5-week seminar on these possibilities, I think at the very least, everybody was saying, wow, this is something to know more about, to learn more about, to investigate, and sort of along with the peer respites, my feeling is we as a society would be much better if we could have a lot of peer respites in a lot of Soteria houses in every community. But I'm going to open it up. I'm going to turn it over. I'm not sure who's moderating the Q&A. Thank you so much. It was really great. I really enjoyed it. And now the audience or the participants can ask you their questions.
So this is Stan. I'm going to leave my video off, I think, if that's okay. But after I've been collecting some of the questions that have been appearing in the chat. You folks who have raised your hands, maybe we'll just kind of start with some of you, if you can. Who do we have? I have to open up the participant screen and get to the top of the.
Laura Van Tosh has her hand raised.
Okay. Okay, Lauren, would you like to, you can turn your video on if you want. You can lower your hand and you're unmuted. And what is your question?
Well, I actually just want to make a comment. I think this has been really instructive, and I appreciate all the speakers, especially the folks who talked about intentional peer support. Mostly because, and I'm calling from Seattle, Washington, by the way, we have not included intentional peer support. I've recommended it a number of times to the people who train the certified peer counselors. I also happen to not be one. So anyhow, but from the outside recommended IPS. And I'm hopeful that when I turn over some of the things I've learned today to them, that they might reconsider. It just really is a much more sensitive approach. I also just in the next, as Bob says, 5 weeks, that I really hope that there can be some discussion from people who have tried to start these programs and ran into, what's the word, either opposition or something like that. And I can tell you that in Seattle, we've had quite a difficult time getting one created and funded and going. So I just think that would really be a good layer to this. Not so much problem solving, but just to put it out there, because not every community is going to be welcoming. And the last thing I just want to add is I was a colleague of Lauren Mosier's, and he was medical director for a regular county mental health department after he started Soteria. And he was just since he's no longer with us, I just want to, like, if people want to have a second of silence. He was really an incredible person at a time when non-peers would never speak out, and he did. So I just want to acknowledge his presence with us spiritually, and that he's in a better space now than perhaps where he was before he left us. So thank you.
And I'm on a very long journey. I've come off medication after 40 years. They've overruled my diagnosis, severe emotional trauma for 40 years. But I'm interested in two things. Firstly, there was a psychiatrist from Israel who I gather got chucked out of mainstream hospital, who set up a Soteria House in Israel. We heard him speak at the Refocus on Recovery conference in Nottingham in 2019. He was absolutely brilliant, but I don't remember his name, but I can probably find that out. Also on the Soteria UK network meeting, we had a chap talking, I think it was, or it may have been a conference in Ireland, about he's setting up a project in Ireland along Soteria lines, but a big farm that he's building and setting up, which I think he hopes to possibly open this year. I'm not sure. The other thing is, of course, I'm really interested in, because I'm involved with Inner Compass. I go on their Zoom calls every Saturday, and they've been a huge help in protracted withdrawal and all of that kind of thing. And I'm really interested to understand as to how this can be fed into sort of support for withdrawal, because there's absolutely nothing out there. And it's a really hard job to get mainstream to get to grips with it. The other thing is about peer workers. We need to be a bit careful, because often I find, and I've read some things on Mad in America about the problems of being peer workers in mainstream, and how often they're only viewed through the lens of illness. If they have a bad day, it's they're ill again. But also, sadly, when I was a peer lead, my other peer lead in a job share turned to me and said, as you're a manager now, it's not appropriate that you ever talk about your experience. You're a manager. It's not good to do that now. And I just looked at her and I thought, that goes against all the values of what a peer is all about. And so I think there's a separation really between peers working in mainstream psychiatry now, but also peers working in Soteria networks and this kind of thing. It seems to be a very, very different problem. And sometimes the stigma and discrimination that you get when you've gone down the not of medication route, all of that is you're treated as anti-psychiatry. And I got trolled very, very badly by other service users in mainstream who, because I'd come off meds and I'd gone down that route, actually trolled me because I was anti-medication. I was doing them all a very bad disservice. So that was really all I wanted to say. So thank you very much for letting me speak.
Thank you.
What's your sense of that, of being coercive or non-coercive?
Is this question for me, Grace?
Yes. When you were talking about that there's two kinds of being with in Soteria, Vermont, somebody had the question about, is the intensive being with non-coercive?
I mean, I would say that it's non-coercive. I mean, it's kind of a requirement of coming to the program that folks are informed that that's part of our process. So at the time of intake, somebody is told like, hey, being at Soteria means that for the first week, we're going to be with you. And this is what being with looks like. So, you know, it's something that somebody knows coming into it and like signs up for. So I don't personally see it as coercive. I think when there's safety concerns, it can at times be a challenge to kind of find that middle ground between saying like, we're concerned for your safety. And to us, safety, like, I mean, like an example is somebody not looking both ways before they cross the street, just like repeatedly running out into traffic. You know, so we're being with just because we're concerned somebody might not be able to find their way back to Soteria, or that they might get like hurt in the community. And just trying to be as transparent in those conversations as possible so folks can understand why we're with them.
Thank you.
Well, you have an interesting story about Soteria was created really without rules. And you've talked about how there weren't rules until you needed a rule. You had an experience maybe you'd like to share where safety was involved.
It'd probably be a good thing to explain where the being with comes from, to get some understanding of that. I think, for instance, being with is really an offshoot of that first week training. We spent the research project that was going on at State Hospital. Part of our training is what we did was we paired up and we went over to the hospital and we found someone that was on that ward and went into a small room, and this was being with that person with no expectations. But it usually wound up about 5-6 hours just doing that, and let that relationships evolve. And by doing that, it was amazing how you start communicating, you start knowing each other and just stuff. And there was no expectation to do. So it's being with, that's where the language starts. But the concept itself has no definite, it sort of resists doing things like making someone do anything, making someone take drugs. By definition, by not locking the door, you're not making someone stay there. Yeah. Those are the broad parameters of being with. You get to, you know, if I'm walking and you walk out the door and I don't want you to walk out the door and I walk out with you, is that, you know, to me, I have a right to walk out with you and I have the right to be concerned about you. And the other thing that justified it, when each person came, part of the discussion was they agreed that Soteria was concerned about their safety and all that stuff. And we would be, if you were going to harm yourself, we would try to not to make you harm yourself. We prevent that kind of behavior. So the expectation was there. So in the sense so it's not something you can quantify in a clear way, but it's sort of a broad concept.
I would really love to jump in here because this idea of being with is dramatically different in my experience at a peer respite. You know, self-injury, which is actually a really common human practice. Some people do it running too much, exercising too much. You know, some forms are acceptable, some are not. If I was concerned about somebody's self-injury, I would ask them, how does it work in their lives? Do you want to talk about how you use this tool and how is this tool working for you? I think for people who have experienced trauma, having somebody follow you can be really traumatic. To not be able to have my own boundaries and to state what they are, I think it's fine for somebody to say, I'm concerned, you know, share whatever your fear is, you know, but with the fear, it's really not fear driven, it's possibility driven. And in fact, there's far less fear if you're actually communicating and mirroring back strength to somebody. Then when they're struggling, they're more likely to tell you. You know, like if I know people sincerely care about me and it's not about, you know, watching me or forced engagement, you know, I'm more likely to come up to you and tell you, hey, I'm struggling in this moment. I don't want to be alone. And sometimes I'll say to somebody, I don't want a conversation, but I don't want to be alone because I feel like I'll fall off the planet. And so one of those times when I was at FIA, the assistant director at the time, we went in the basement and we built a ping pong table and said not a word. And it was the most helpful thing in the world for me because, you know, that's what I needed in that moment. And so I just want to say, you know, if you looked in the IPS model of mutuality, you know, if it's not working for one person, it's not working. And so I think that has to be negotiated. And so I don't want people to get, you know, there may be different models and different concepts. And I truly appreciate that people at Soteria are actually trying to provide support. I truly appreciate that. But it still sounds like a really big power imbalance. And so that concerns me. And I just want people to know a pure peer respite, one that's not clinically affiliated, you know, that hopefully would not be what was going on.
And I just would like to jump in and respond that I completely agree with you. And I would say that like 90% of the time, that's how my experience with Soteria was. Like the examples that I'm talking about are very extreme examples. So people that are refusing to put on clothes and it's below 0 degrees and they're walking outside naked. You know, like the ceiling being torn apart. Like there are certain times when we do have limitations, and some of that I'll just own is because we are still tied a little bit into the medical model, right? Like we're still actually funded as a therapeutic community residence. Like there are certain limitations that come with that. So I totally hear you. And I also want to just acknowledge out loud that there are limitations, I think, in order for at least Soteria Vermont to exist. And the reason it hasn't been like shut down is because we do have some like restrictions around, I guess, conceptions of safety sometimes. So I just want to say, Cindy, that I agree with you, and thanks.
Thank you.
Cindy, I just want to make sure I'm not disagreeing with you. I agree with you. There's no problem with that. But sometimes with the individuals we were dealing with, sometimes we had one who was trying to commit suicide. So there's this issue in my personal, this is not Soteria, but because I had such a huge part of Soteria, you can't deny it is a part of Soteria. So, but my feeling is if I'm committed to someone in a relationship and you do something to yourself, you are doing something to me too. The implication that you're some separate thing, the issue of Imbutu that I referred to, suicide, you have done something to me. So I have the right to sort of fix that. It might impose on your right too. And if I do that, I have some kind of explanation to you and some commitments. It's not a simple thing. 90% of the time, we didn't go out and follow it. But there was, you know, so it's complicated.
Yeah, mutuality, right?
Yeah,
mutuality. I'm sorry, I can't watch you die.
Yes,
I can't do that. It's not. It doesn't work for me.
You're doing something.
But they also can get to say, you know what? I don't want you in my room.
Yeah, yeah. But we were.
So you got to balance that out. I agree with you.
I also want to say here something. First,
we had this on the second floor. My personal philosophy, anyone has the right to kill themselves, technically. But on the other side of that, if you're someone really personally to me, if you kill yourself, you're doing something to me. And that reposes a larger right to act. So it's like I said, it's not simple. It's more complicated.
Rami, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I want to say first something about the being with, how we see it in Israel, that it's like a non-verbal communication. It doesn't mean that you will be with a person if he doesn't want it. It's a channel that you feel him and you see what he wants, how much he wants you to be closer to him, how much he wants you to be far from him. And it's like a dancing. It's like a dancing with another person to feel what you want, to be with him. all your focus is on him. And sometimes person needs more, sometimes person need less. And sometimes people in a psychotic situation need more than a person that's not in psychotic situation. I can tell you one situation that a person that had a catatonic situation, I brought my face very close to his face. And only when my face touched his face, he was like out from his catatonic situation. Like, oh, hi, Avremi, I didn't notice that you're here. I will never get so closer to another person. But I feel that in that situation, that's what you need. But you need all the time to feel. You cannot say what is a being with. You need to feel every person what he needs. And another thing about boundaries and about safety, in Israel, we have a story that of a being with, of a prince that saw that he's a turkey and take his clothes out and was under the table and started to shout like a turkey, and a smart guy came and being with him. But then we're saying in Israel that you can be whatever you want, but you cannot do your stuff on my bed. So you have here the communication. The problem is interpersonal, not inside of you. And when you take out the problem from yourself to the interpersonal environments, it's another way to think about things.
Thank you, Avremi. We need to keep moving. We've got about 7
Stan,
minutes.
actually, we need to leave 5 minutes at the end for closing. So maybe there's one more question.
Okay, let's try for 2. Jim, you're up next. So would you like to unmute and join us? What is your question?
Button's not, oh, there it is. Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, so I just had comments, I guess. As a caregiver, I live in a small town. I think the chances of getting a Soteria House here are very slim, but I've followed the work that's being done, and I'd like to I appreciate some of the anecdotal stories that have been told, and I'm just wondering, and I don't need an answer now, but in the future discussions, sort of how it plays out. What can I take home about this? I mean, what can I be my own Soteria House here? And that's kind of, and there's so many parents out there with loved ones. I mean, we're crying out for this. And then I have one more comment. I was, and don't ask me how I ended up. I was on a website. It's a thing called Trust Technique, and I think I was trying to get my son involved with horse therapy, and this guy was working with animals, and he was teaching people how to work closely with animals and how to gain their trust. And it was absolutely stunning, the work that he is doing. It's a lot of the animals, he said that animals that have eyes on the side of their heads are prey. And he'll just sit in a corral with horses, and he'll just sit there. And I don't know how long he's there, but they end up laying.
This has been a truly awesome experience. I'm so glad to be a part of this. And I just want to thank everyone again, all of our sponsors, all of Mind Freedom and Rethinking Psychiatry for putting on this event, and all the organizers that help make this event possible. It's just been a really good event, and we've had over 230 people. That's impressive from around the world. So thank you everyone for attending. And I think this is where we'll end, but we'll still stay on. And with that, I'll just ask my question now that I think we're kind of officially over. And my question is to the summit people. There was a fabulous discussion about making Soteria houses and Peer Respite kind of home-based. And a lot of people think that's a good idea, but I just want to toss it out to you that, you know, what do you think of, you know, making these programs into a home-based or a virtual, you know, is there still a need for buildings? I'm a big believer in brick and mortar. I believe that people need to sometimes have a place to go to. So I just wanted to ask you guys what your
For me, I think the issue, if home-based versus the other, the option for me, if there's nothing else, the other is needed, you know, and what that means is a little more complicated to a degree, but life is not always this or that. It may be a combination or something, what's better for this and what's better for that kind of thing. But preferably the bricks and mortar makes the most sense.
This is Vic. I'll chime in. I think that both and. I think whenever folks are being presented with more options and not fewer, it's a win. And I think in terms of longevity and sustainability of programs, one of the challenges is staffing. You know, having a building operating 24/7, having people working around the clock can be a real challenge. And so looking at models where, you know, it's a shorter term availability, being in somebody's home, you know, where it's, you know, one person or two people staying with an individual versus, you know, a fully staffed building around the clock. You know, I think there's room for creating different models that work for different communities, different populations, and, you know, being in conversation with your community about what makes the most sense. I think from a disability lens as well, the in-home supports make a lot of sense because not all buildings are accessible, and accessibility looks different in terms of not just having a ramp, but also is it accessible in terms of a sensory environment? You know, is there chemical sensitivity issues, or is the person just more comfortable in their home or wouldn't have access to things in their home, you know, that they would need during this time? So those are some pieces that come to mind for me.
Thank you. I would just like to thank Remy just left, and just want to make sure that you, Vic and Cindy and everyone, that you're aware of how much Katie, your input and your presence here. Okay. Ian, you had your hand up earlier and you're not in the order because you put it up again, but Ian, what is your question? Let's unmute you. And
yeah, hi, I'd just like to go back through the conversation. Thanks, Grace, for that intentional peer support promotion. It's one of the standards that's run in Australia. There's also a peer zone which was developed in New Zealand with, oh, she'd hate me. Yeah, Peer Zone, which is an education package for consumers, run by peers, and it might just be a leverage. It's all over America and Northern America, parts of New Zealand. But getting into Respite, there was an organisation, and still exists, Carers New South Wales, which is for carers of consumers with mental health issues. And although it's not a program or a drop-in house, they had 2 properties available to them. And you talk about hands-off, it was very, very important. What it was an opportunity for family holidays. And it was a program that was funded by the New South Wales government for carers to have respite from their caring role to take their loved ones away from an environment which is stressful often to their health, and have a holiday. There was one at the beach and there was one in the country. So it was a very interesting program that is, to my knowledge, still funded by Carers New South Wales. But it goes to the point of recognising that a lot of distress comes from environments, and that includes appointments with doctors and psychiatrists and psychologists, and all those places that consumers are quite often corralled into. They don't have that choice, I applaud Carers New South Wales for continuing to run that program. There's no such thing in Australia or New South Wales that I know of, which is like a halfway house for mental health consumers run by peers. But there is a lot of peer workers. Every psychiatric hospital in Australia has peer workers working alongside clinicians, and they're recognised as a vital part of the caring team, and it's promoted with that language. There is a risk for peer workers in Australia to be co-opted into those teams, and to move away from the peer principles of those human, very rich relationships that consumers can have, particularly with peer workers. I left a note in the chats about I used to be promoting my role when I was a peer worker, stating that the other support workers were paid to be friendly and I was paid to be your friend, and I'd like to be your friend. Would you like that? In fact, inviting rather than offering. You know, there's a difference between inviting someone into a relationship and offering them a relationship. And I've worked with many people very briefly that I couldn't continue working with on a peer level within services that who live within my community that I bump into and am friendly with all the time. I'm living in Western Sydney, in which I work, and I've worked as a peer worker for over 15 years. The opportunity people have to seek something valuable outside services is one of the difficult parts of recovery. How do I take myself away from what the world tells me I am and then write my own story? And it was Voice who recognized or has identified that as what is valuable to me, and really actually getting into that relationship around what is valuable to me. For me, peer work is been a wonderful journey, and like many other peers, we lose friends along the way. So, just in closing, I'd like to recognise that we have had brothers and sisters that we've lost. Recognise also with the technology now that we can reach around the world. And it's now 6:15 in the morning over here, and I got up at 2:30 to join this. So I'll be back next time. Thank you for your time.
So glad you could be here, Ian. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
You guys
thanks.
In Australia, New Zealand have been doing some amazing work. We have Louise. Louise, you're next on my list here. Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, and it was another comment actually, just a couple of things. It wasn't until actually I fell into the withdrawal communities that I realised there's a great big mismatch between service users who seem to be trapped in the mainstream systems and very, very believing in the medical model themselves, And I find the peer support in the mainstream that as well. And what I was quite shocked about was they started to write a national guidance really about peer values and training and lots of things, which although was well informed by peers I believe one of the troubles was it was finally written up by the professionals. So I think it seems to be a really big mismatch going on between service users who are going down this route of Soteria and withdrawal, and that seems to have really been damaged in a way by mainstream psychiatry, and those who are still stuck in it, who have been so infected in a way by the medical model themselves, they cannot see another way through. That's all they see. But the other thing is that one of the other things I'm thinking about is the Trieste model in Italy, which has done away with mental health hospitals completely. And I think, is it Norway that's actually passed a law for medication-free wards, which I think is interesting. The other thing I wanted to say was about the difference between home treatment and going to somewhere. And I think there's room for both, particularly in somewhere like the UK, where you could either have a home system or a day system, which is networked to a regional or county place where you could actually stay. So if you were struggling, either going out to a daycare place or having home treatment, you could then be referred on to a regional centre where you could actually stay if you were in more of a crisis. So yeah, that's what I wanted to add really.